This is our teaching video for the fifth Sunday in Lent, March the 22nd, 2015. We're going to be focusing on the second reading in the Gospel for this teaching video, and so the first thing we're going to do is talk about priests. When we read the book of Hebrews, we hear a lot about the priesthood of Jesus, which is something we don't talk about that much, but we should. And we hear the name Melchizedek, so we need to review who Melchizedek is and why he's important in understanding who Jesus is. And then we're going to look at the Gospel of John, particularly as it relates to Jesus' passion and the last Passover that Jesus will spend in Jerusalem. So we're going to talk a little bit about Jerusalem itself, which will also tie us back to Melchizedek. We're going to talk about when Jesus talks about the hour. The hour has come, he says. And we're going to talk about wheat as an image of death and resurrection. To understand the priesthood, we need to go to the 12 tribes of Israel. If you remember, Jacob had 12 sons. The descendants of those 12 sons make up the 12 tribes. And when they settle the land in the book of Joshua, they each receive an inheritance of land. And so this map shows the various geographical boundaries of that inheritance. And of the sons of Jacob and the tribes of Israel, there's one tribe that does not receive any land. So if you were going to look at this map, you would not be able to find the tribe of Levi. There's a reason for that. The Levites, as they're called, do not receive an inheritance of land because their inheritance is God himself. And this is, the Levites are the tribe of Israel set aside to become the priests. So we can draw a line from Jacob's son Levi to the Levites to the priests of Israel. So we can say that the tribe of Levi becomes the priests. Now, one of the things that we see develop in the Bible fairly early on, near Mount Sinai, is a subsection of the priests become the serious priests, we might say, and those are Aaron and Aaron's descendants. And the Aaron's descendants are called the Aaronides. And so we see them becoming the priests in the temple, doing sacrifice and what we think of as priestly acts. And then we have Levites, who end up being descendants of Levi, not descended from Aaron, who end up doing work around the temple. So not the priestly work, but they end up doing choir duty. They end up doing other administrative tasks in the temple. Now, an important thing to understand in the development of the priesthood is during the time of David, because what David does is David consolidates all worship in the temple in Jerusalem. And so to do that, though, he has to make a political choice. He takes a Levite from the north, so we'll call them a northern Levite, and his name is Abiathar. And if that sounds obscure, Jesus himself refers to Abiathar in one of his teachings. And then he takes a southern Aaronite, and he brings them together into Jerusalem. So he tries to unite and consolidate priestly power, and that southern Aaronite is named Zadok. Now, what ends up happening is when David dies and Solomon takes over, there is a fight for succession, and Abiathar actually ends up fighting on the side of Adonijah, who's a contender for the throne. Solomon wins, and Zadok fights with Solomon, and so the Zadokite priesthood ends up being the line that develops all the way to the temple in Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. Now, that may seem obscure, but it's important to understand then we can draw a line from Jacob to Levi, Levi to Aaron, Aaron to Zadok, Zadok to Jesus. And it's important because the keeping and rhythms of the temple and the priesthood help us understand important issues of being able to relate to God. Now, take all of that and apply it to the second reading in Hebrews, because you'll notice the writer of Hebrews doesn't say Jesus is a priest in the order of Levi. He does not say that Jesus is a priest in the order of Aaron. He says Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. And this is an important claim on the authority of Jesus, that Jesus' authority as a priest is not genetic. It is not a matter of inheritance. Jesus' authority is from God. So Jesus isn't a high priest like Jason the high priest during the time of the Maccabees. Jesus is not a high priest like Caiaphas the high priest at the time of his crucifixion. Jesus is a high priest whose authority comes directly from God and not from any political power or any claim on family ancestry. So who is this character named Melchizedek? Well, Melchizedek is found in the book of Genesis. And so Melchizedek appears as a priest before there were priests. And so that's one thing Hebrews is kind of calling to mind, a priest before there were priests. Melchizedek's name means king of righteousness, and he ends up living in the city of the Jebusites, and this is important because the Jebusites live in what will become Jerusalem. So you have this king of righteousness who lives in Jerusalem, whose authority is from God, and so this becomes a prefiguring of Christ, the king of righteousness, who will rule from Jerusalem, not just as a king, but a priest. This is one of the panels from the Peter Paul Rubens exhibit we went to at the Getty that shows Abraham appearing before Melchizedek after a battle. And Melchizedek is here on the right, and so he's kind of this king priest. Here's Abraham after the battle bringing offering of bread and wine. And so this is another reason that Jesus is prefigured in Melchizedek. The offering is bread and wine. There's almost this Eucharistic offering made to the king of righteousness. Now, as a side note, too, this is where we get one of the images of tithing. Abram makes a 10% gift to Melchizedek as a tithe. And so he makes an offering which is 10%. And so this is one of the first places that we see the biblical image of tithing, making a gift to the king of righteousness. Hopefully then this gives you at least a few ideas of who Melchizedek is and why it's important when the writer from Hebrews talks about Jesus being a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And remember, Jesus takes the worship in the temple, applies it to himself, so he's both priest and sacrifice, offering for the sake of the world. All right, we're going to change gears a little bit, and I've put up on the screen a picture of the doomsday clock. And the doomsday clock is something I think people know about. This is from Reuters. And remember, it was this clock where if the hands met midnight, it would be doomsday. So the clock was introduced as part of the atomic age during times of Soviet-American difficulties. The clock would get closer to 0 minutes to midnight. It went down, it went up, it went down, it went up, it went down. The Cold War ended, and it has since gone up during the since the Cold War. And it's this idea that if the time comes, if the clock strikes midnight, then we will have apocalypse. And so we almost have this sense of ticking time and human beings being warned about an hour that is coming. Well, this is something when we turn to the Gospel of John that we hear Jesus talking about. So I want you to pay attention to this on Sunday. He will say, "The hour has come. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." And so this is something we hear about in the writer from Hebrews 2, the glorification of God. And so this is where God's name and God's light will receive their proper due. And it doesn't happen through a show of force, but it will happen in the glorification of the cross. When Jesus talks about the hour, he's talking about the definitive event of God's salvation. So very much like the doomsday clock, saying something definitive and irreversible is going to happen. When Jesus says the hour has come, he's announcing that the definitive act of salvation is going to be happening, and in that definitive event, God himself will be glorified, God's name will be glorified. And so we even hear this part of the gospel where God speaks and says, "I have glorified my name, and I will glorify my name." Now, part of connecting the glorification of the name and the coming of the hour and trying to unpack what this definitive event of salvation will be, Jesus uses the image of wheat. So here we have on the screen some wheat that is at the time of the harvest. And remember, Jesus also uses the image of weeds, so we have wheat and weeds, and you can't tell the difference between wheat and weeds until they flower and fruit. So the fruit finally shows you what you have. And that we might say it's the same with our lives. Sometimes we don't know. Only when we see the fruitfulness produced by God do we see that God has been totally at work. Now, what he says is, I will be like a grain of wheat. And so here we have a grain of wheat, and we know, if they're going to crush this grain of wheat, we have whole grain bread. Sometimes they take parts out of it to make enriched flour. It's only part of the grain of wheat. And to make certain kinds of bread, you can use different kinds of wheat. But of course, what we're interested in with what Jesus is saying is the only way the wheat can fulfill its purpose, its sort of fruitful potential, is by being planted dead in the ground. And so only this germ of life can only be activated to become new life once it's been separated from the stalk and it can grow up and become new. We might say planted in every human being uh, in the church is this promise of new life, this germ of new life. And what Jesus is saying is you have to trust that once you are dead in the ground, God has a seed of new life that will grow, and we will not just talk about resuscitation, we will talk about resurrection. And so when Jesus talks about his hour and glorification, that glorification will be nothing less than the promise of new life being made real at Easter. So that's what we have to hear Jesus say. So not only is Jesus the high priest who makes a sacrifice of himself, that sacrifice is not destroyed, but is actually renewed and resurrected as a sign of everlasting life. Hopefully that gives you a few things to think about in your own life with God, and we'll see you on Sunday.